The silence in the empty classroom was deafening. 17-year-old Emma Martinez pressed her back against the cold brick wall, her heart hammering against her ribs as three figures blocked the doorway. What started as another day of trying to blend into the background at Westfield Academy had just taken a terrifying turn. The bullies who had been tormenting her for weeks finally had her exactly where they wanted her, alone, trapped with nowhere to run. But what they didn't know was that Emma's older brother had just returned from his latest deployment overseas, and he was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the windows of Westfield Academy like a shroud, obscuring the view of the bustling parking lot beyond. Emma Martinez clutched her worn leather messenger bag tighter as she navigated through the sea of students flooding through the main entrance. 3 weeks had passed since she'd transferred to this prestigious private school in the heart of Connecticut, and she still felt like a ghost wandering through halls that belonged to someone else. Moving had never been easy for the Martinez family. With her brother deployed overseas and her mother working double shifts at the hospital, Emma had learned to adapt quickly to new environments. But Westfield Academy was different from the public schools she'd attended before. Here, everything seemed to revolve around family names, trust funds, and social hierarchies that had been established long before she ever stepped foot on campus. Emma preferred it this way, staying invisible. She'd perfected the art of moving through crowds without drawing attention, of finding the quietest corners in the library, of eating lunch alone while appearing completely content with her solitude. It wasn't that she was antisocial. She simply understood that sometimes the safest place to be was in the shadows. Her first period, advanced literature class, was already half full when she slipped through the door. She'd claimed the same seat every day since starting third row from the back right side, next to the window. It offered her the perfect view of the courtyard, while keeping her relatively hidden from the social dynamics that played out in the front rows. Mrs. Henderson was discussing the themes in To Kill a Mockingbird when Emma noticed the whispers starting. It began as a low murmur from the cluster of students who occupied the prime real estate in the front of the classroom, the ones who treated every class like their personal social club. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the intricate patterns the morning light made as it filtered through the oak trees outside. "Did you see her backpack?" The voice belonged to Madison Pierce, the unofficial queen of Westfield Academy's junior class. Her family had been attending the school for 3 generations, and she wore that legacy like a crown. "It's probably from some discount store." Emma's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed on her notebook. She'd learned long ago that responding to comments like these only made things worse. Her backpack might not have been designer leather, but it carried her books just fine. "I heard she's here on some kind of scholarship," whispered another voice, this one belonging to Tiffany Walsh, Madison's loyal lieutenant. "My dad knows someone on the admissions board. They had to make room for more diverse students." The word diverse dripped with disdain, and Emma felt her cheeks burn. She'd worked harder than anyone to earn her place at Westfield Academy. Her grades were impeccable, her test scores in the top percentile, and she'd written essays that had impressed even the most selective admissions committees. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to fitting in. "She probably doesn't even know what half the books on our reading list are," Madison continued, her voice just loud enough for Emma to hear. "Some of us grew up with culture." Emma's pencil snapped in her grip. She stared down at the broken pieces, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to turn around, to tell Madison exactly what she thought about her definition of culture, to explain that she'd read more books in the past year than Madison had probably touched in her entire life. But she didn't. Instead, she quietly pulled out another pencil and continued taking notes. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of similar encounters. In chemistry, her lab partner forgot, to save her a seat, forcing Emma to work alone while everyone else paired up. During lunch, she overheard a group of girls discussing the upcoming winter formal, pointedly excluding her from their conversation, even though she was sitting at the next table over. By the time Emma reached her final class of the day, a P history, she was emotionally drained. The constant microaggressions, the subtle exclusions, the way certain students looked through her as if she were made of glass, it all wore on her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. Mr. Rodriguez was passionate about his subject, and Emma genuinely enjoyed his classes. History had always been her favorite subject, partly because it reminded her of the stories her brother used to tell her about the places he'd traveled during his military service. Today's lesson focused on military strategy during World War II, and Emma found herself thinking about Jake's letters from his latest deployment. "Miss Martinez," Mr. Rodriguez called out, pulling her from her thoughts. "Can you tell us about the significance of the D-Day invasion?" Emma straightened in her chair, grateful for the opportunity to contribute. The D-Day invasion was crucial because it opened a second front in Western Europe, forcing Germany to divide their forces. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history, involving over 150,000 Allied troops. The success of the operation ultimately led to the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. A few students turned to look at her with surprise, as if they hadn't expected her to know the answer. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. "Show off," she muttered under her breath. Emma felt her confidence deflate slightly. Even when she demonstrated her knowledge, it was somehow wrong. Too quiet, and she was invisible. Too knowledgeable, and she was showing off. There seemed to be no middle ground where she could simply exist without judgment. After class, Emma took her time gathering her books, hoping to avoid the rush of students heading to their lockers. She'd learned to time her movements carefully, finding the gaps between the social clusters that dominated the hallways. But as she stepped out of the classroom, she nearly collided with Madison and her two closest friends, Tiffany and Brooke Stevens. "Watch it," Madison snapped, even though Emma had clearly been trying to avoid them. "Sorry," Emma mumbled, stepping aside to let them pass. But instead of moving on, the three girls formed a semicircle around her. Emma's stomach dropped. She'd managed to avoid direct confrontation so far, but something in Madison's expression told her that her luck was about to run out. "You know," Madison said, her voice taking on a mock thoughtful tone, "I've been wondering about something. How exactly does someone like you end up at a school like this?" Emma's grip tightened on her bag. "I applied, just like everyone else." "Right, but see, that's what I find interesting," Madison continued, stepping closer. "Everyone else here has family connections, or their parents made significant donations, or they've been on the waiting list for years. But you just appeared. Maybe she's got some kind of special circumstances," Tiffany chimed in, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You know, like a hardship case or something." Emma's face burned with embarrassment and anger. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she'd earned her place through merit alone, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. These girls had probably never had to work for anything in their lives, never had to worry about scholarship applications or part-time jobs to help with expenses. "I should go," Emma said quietly, trying to step around them. "Oh, but we're just getting to know you," Brooke said, moving to block her path. "We hardly ever talk, and you've been here for weeks now. That's not very social of you." Emma looked around the hallway, hoping to spot a teacher or administrator, but the corridor was emptying out as students headed to their after-school activities. She was essentially alone with the three girls who seemed determined to make her life miserable. "I really need to get going," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To what?" Madison asked with a cruel smile. "It's not like you have any friends to hang out with, or any clubs to go to, or any activities at all, really." The truth of the statement hit Emma like a physical blow. She hadn't joined any clubs. or sports teams, partly because she was still adjusting to the new school, but mostly because she'd been focused on keeping her grades up and staying out of trouble. But hearing it laid out so starkly made her realize just how isolated she'd become. "You're like a ghost," Tiffany added. "Just floating through the halls, not really part of anything." Emma's hands began to shake. She thought about her brother, about the strength and courage he'd shown in facing much more dangerous situations than this. But somehow, standing in this hallway facing 3 teenage girls felt overwhelming in a way that surprised her. "Please," Emma said, her voice cracking slightly. "I just want to go home." "Home," Madison repeated, as if the word amused her. "Where exactly is home for you, Emma?" "Because something tells me it's not the same kind of neighborhood the rest of us come from." Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd managed to hold it together for weeks, to weather the subtle insults and exclusions without breaking down. But there was something about being cornered like this, about having her insecurities laid bare by girls who had everything handed to them, that finally cracked her carefully constructed armor. "I don't understand why you're doing this," Emma whispered. "Doing what?" Madison asked with false innocence. "Having a conversation? Getting to know our new classmate? There's nothing wrong with that." But Emma could see the malice in her eyes, the way Madison fed off her discomfort. This wasn't about getting to know her, it was about establishing dominance, about putting Emma in her place before she could somehow threaten the social order that Madison had worked so hard to maintain.